Hello and welcome to the Curious Cat Bookshop podcast. I'm Stacy Whitman, I'm your host, and I'm the owner of the Curious Cat Bookshop. And today we're going to be talking about a number of things. It's the end of August. I've been MIA here on the podcast for a while, and we'll get to that later as we talk about the state of the store and what I've been working on this year. But first, I wanted to talk about something really important. I have a lot on my plate all the time as a business owner, but especially this year. Again, we'll talk about the details of that in a moment. But what that means is oftentimes I'm so behind on getting displays up. And it occurred to me 2 weeks after watching the Odyssey, the movie, that maybe I should make an Odyssey display, like this Emily Wilson translation and her translation of the Iliad that everyone is talking about, but also books that are inspired by the Odyssey and the Iliad. Circe is a great example of that. I've got a few others that I'm waiting on coming into the store. And one of my most favorites, and not just because I edited the book, is Summer of the Mariposas by Guadalupe Garcia McCall. This is a beautiful book about 5 sisters. It is a retelling of the Odyssey from the point of view of the eldest of 5 Mexican-American sisters who find a body in their swimming hole right in the Rio Grande, and their dad has left the family. They see this guy's family photo in his wallet, and they decide, you know what? We can't make dad come home, but we can bring this guy home to his family in Mexico. So off they go on an adventure, magical adventure, assisted by Tonantzin, who is kind of the Virgin of Guadalupe. There's a lot of syncretism going on in the story. Virgen de Guadalupe probably is closer to the right pronunciation. But anyway, La Llorona is involved right there on the river. And it is a beautiful, beautiful story of sisterhood and mothers loving their children and sacrificing everything for them in the midst of great struggle. And just a romping story because it is a retelling of the Odyssey. So these girls have a pretty easy journey to take the man back to his family in Mexico. But then when they try to come home, they meet Cecilia, who is a witch. They meet a Nagual, who is a warlock who shapeshifts and tries to put them in a pot of soup. They meet lechuzas, which are wicked owl witches who attack them in a barn that they're trying to stay in at night. And they meet a one-eyed chupacabras. Those are the creatures and magical beings from Mexican folklore that have parallels in this story to the Odyssey. Guadalupe was a 6th grade teacher when she wrote this book. She was mostly writing poetry at the time. Her first book that was published was a beautiful novel in verse called Under the Mesquite, which is a novel in verse about a 16-year-old girl who loses her mother to cancer. And then this came across her editor's desk at Lee & Low, where I used to work. And her editor was like, I edit poetry, I don't edit fantasy. And I had just started working at Lee & Low. I had just started acquiring for my imprint 2 books. And this was the perfect book. This is the book that I had been looking for. So we released this in 2012. And now there are more than 1 million copies in print. Well, I'm actually not sure. Last time I looked, which was right before I was laid off almost a year ago, we had been approaching 1 million. So I'm assuming that there are now more than 1 million copies in print. It's never made it onto the New York Times list. If you talk to somebody who isn't involved with the school system, they would not know this book probably. But if you know someone who is a teacher or who is a librarian or who has taken the Odyssey in some class where they're also reading retellings along the way to help kids understand it, Summer of the Mariposas is in curriculum all over the country. And it is such a beautiful book to hand to a 6th grader who might not understand the language, even if it's a plainer translation, even if it's in language that is more understandable to a modern reader. This is going to be more relatable than something that was handed down by oral tradition more than 2,000 years ago. So anyway, my point is that retellings can really help us understand the classics, help us to see a new perspective, help us to understand new cultures that we might not have had experience with before, or as happened in Guadalupe's actual 6th grade class when she was teaching them the Odyssey to kids from the border in Texas. Her 6th grade girls walked out of class and said, "Miss, we need our own Odyssey. And she said, yes. Yes, you do, because they were struggling so hard to understand. I'm not dissing classics. I'm just saying kids need a doorway sometimes into those classics that they can understand. And Summer of the Mariposas does that. Why am I telling you all this? Well, the same day that I'm finally putting together this display of books that relate to the Odyssey 3 weeks after it comes out, and I'm still waiting on a few to come in because the book about Penelope that I was going to pull from the shelves actually sold before I could put it in the display. So I'm waiting for a new copy to come in for it. Not the Penelope ad. It's not about Penelope. It's about somebody else. One of Helen's sister, whose name I'm blanking on. The same day I'm putting this display together, Guadalupe sends a link to me and says, have you seen this? And that's when I found out that in the Peoria Unified School District, a committee voted to remove 3 books from 6th through 8th grade curriculum because the works are not considered age appropriate. This was written by a 6th grade teacher for 6th graders in Texas. I defy anyone to go through this book and find a curse word, to find the kind of racial violence they're claiming is in here, or anything of the sort that would apply to the policies that they're claiming that it violates. There is not a single thing in here that I would not hand to an 11 or 12-year-old. I would hand it to a 9 or 10-year-old. There's no romance. There's nothing in this that I would not hand to somebody that discusses from the point of view of 5 Mexican American girls that somebody crossed the border illegally and died in the river. That's it. And it doesn't discuss it in any other way than saying, he is a father and we want to return him to his family. That's it. They are U.S. citizens, and when they return at the end of the book to the U.S., they have help from a goddess because they don't have their birth certificates. That's it. Now, that says to me, they cannot handle discussing the point of view of Mexican American kids. Now, if they had just decided to phase it out because they decided to go a different direction in their curriculum, that's one thing. But when they're claiming that they're doing it for policy reasons, including the banning of DEI, they're claiming that this book is offensive for 6th graders. So anyway, I had to cover that because that is just absolute nonsense to me. And if your state is dealing with these book bans, I can only ask you to please get involved and make sure that your voice is heard. They're also banning the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass and A Raisin in the Sun as inappropriate for this age group. And they're saying that narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass and A Raisin in the Sun will still remain in the library, but they're banning this from the library as well. If this were just a curricular direction, they wouldn't be banning it from the library. If you don't have a freedom to read law in your state the way we do here in Connecticut, Massachusetts just passed one. I think New York is either passed one and is working on one. Multiple states have been working on this. And there is a raft of book banning bills making their way through Congress nationally as well. I ask that you get involved. Go to your local school board meetings and watch these discussions where they're talking about age inappropriate books. Get involved and ask why they think it's inappropriate to discuss the facts of history or the facts of someone's existence. As you can guess, I'm having a hard time. Number one, I'm having a hard time speaking because my cheek is still numb and I keep biting it as I talk. But I am so furious about this. And this is only one banning. There are so many books that just address the existence of trans people, that just address the existence of LGBTQ people for children out there that have been banned in multiple states. Look at the book bans in Utah, for example. If a book gets banned by a school district 3 times by like 3 different school districts, I think the law is, it's banned in the whole state. which means that if conservative rural Utah decides that Salt Lake shouldn't be allowed to read something like Summit of the Mariposas, somehow they have the right to tell other school districts what their kids can read. As you can imagine, I'm furious about this. I could probably just ramble on about this for a while, but instead what I'm going to do is move on to the state of the store. As I've mentioned here before, back in January, I had to let a couple of our employees go simply because sales were down. Everybody is dealing with it. It's not just us as a store, it's this whole area. So many people, not just myself, who have been laid off in the last 6 months to a year in our area. Just tariffs and economic policies and just all of the things that are happening and being talked about on a national basis that we have no control over, like defunding libraries, denying national grants approved by Congress to blue states, denying funding to universities, all sorts of pulling of funds from museums and the arts. All of these things that we think don't necessarily affect us on a daily basis are absolutely affecting our local economies all across the nation as people lose jobs. Add to that all the AI fervor. I just talked to a candidate for state representative who said that she herself lost her job because she was replaced by AI. How do we survive all of this and come out on the other side thriving? It's a giant question that I don't have the answer to, but for my store, I'm trying to find our answer. Part of that is doing things like hosting Democracy Reads Book Club with our local Indivisible chapter. We're talking about all the ways that we can get involved. Civic involvement locally. All politics are local. Thinking about gerrymandering, thinking about how our schools work and are funded, how our roads are taken care of, how our states run their budgets. These are all things that we can have a say in more than, for example, on a national or even worldwide level. So that's something that we are talking about in our Democracy Reads Book Club. So if you are local, we'd love to have you join us this month. We are talking about Chris Murphy's new book, and we will be having a special guest. Well, I just realized that our special guest is not on the calendar the way that she should be, and I'm blanking on her name, so I need to go back into there and make sure that her coming here as a candidate for a local state office is on the calendar so that people know she's coming, and she's going to discuss Crisis of the Common Good with us, Chris Murphy's newest book. And that's what we're talking about, is what is the common good on a local level, on a county, or here in Connecticut, town-wide level. Our counties do exist, but the medium-sized unit of government here in Connecticut is not a county, it's a town, kind of like a township where I come from in Illinois. It's a little bit confusing to anyone outside of Connecticut. It took me a while to wrap my brain around. I think it might be similar in Rhode Island and Massachusetts, like being a New England thing, but I'm not 100% sure. But we're going to be talking about that. And the point that I'm making is we're working on what we can do to become more involved locally in civic engagement. I'm not talking necessarily about politics, but about policy and about advocating for the common good. For example, my friend Carrie, I think I posted a short about this, but I don't think I have talked about it on the podcast yet. She owned the Railway Cafe down the street, and back in June, she was murdered. Her husband murdered her. He has been arrested for murder, and the legal process is moving forward, but she had a court order against him. She had a restraining order, or whatever that's called. It's a full court order where she went through and she proved his abusiveness, and yet he still murdered her. He had no ankle monitoring. She had no way of knowing that he was going to enter her home that night. And right now, people in town have been very affected by it. If you come to the store, you'll see that we have purple hearts and purple lights in the window, and that's the color for domestic abuse awareness. And there are people in town who are advocating for what we call Carrie's Law in honor of Carrie Stetson. they're talking about simple reforms that could protect the next person so that they wouldn't have to go through what Carrie goes through. Simple things like if they have a court order to stay away, then they have to be ankle monitored and maybe alarms go off if they violate that order. They're working on what that policy would look like. It's going through the process with our legislators here in the state, and we're getting periodic updates for it from the organizers who are working on it, who are relatives and friends of Carrie's. So that's something that we can do, that we have the power to do, and we are a third space for our communities. That's something that we can do locally. So anyway, that's one thing that we've been working on this year. The other thing that I've been working on this year, and I will link you to I still haven't quite figured out how to put an actual video in the middle of my videos, but if I do it right, it'll be right here, about how I'm implementing a CRM system. And that's something I've been working on since last fall. And I have finally gotten to a place where I actually have a dashboard where I can see all this data of what my sales looked like this year so far versus last year versus 2024. I'm still working on 2023, which was our first year in business, getting my bills from publishers and sideline vendors into that whole system so that I can budget appropriately and forecast. All of this is in preparation. I feel like I'm finally at a point where I can go and take that information and go to a bank or perhaps one of our community lenders. And I've been working with the Connecticut Women's Business Development Center Council. Anyway, I've been working with them to get to a point where I am ready to try to get full capitalization. And what that means is that we would not be bootstrapping it anymore. I started the business with my bonus back in 2023 for the year, and plus a grant that I got. And then the next year I put whatever I could save into it. I had, from my full-time job, I was working my full-time job and paying for my mortgage and everything, and whatever I could, I was pouring into building the business. And I wasn't paying myself. I was just, whatever we were making, I was plowing it back into the business. And even so, cash flow has just been such a challenge. And what I really need to figure out, the biggest challenge this year, and why I've been working so hard, is that without employees to take on tasks it is not humanly possible for me to do everything that a bookstore needs. If I am working on something like the CRM, I'm neglecting the podcast. If I am working on the podcast, I'm neglecting social media or our email list. So recently I did just hire Roxy as our new senior bookseller. You might see her on our social media from time to time. And she has the experience and the know-how to be taking over marketing duties and to grow in that side of the business. And what I'd really love to do is to be fully funded enough to have not just one or two people that I can delegate to, but a staff that I can delegate to so that I can manage the business and that I don't have to do everything myself, because it is not humanly possible to do literally everything myself. I have been trying to do that this year, except I did keep Sarah on because she was running the book clubs, trying to be in the store every day we're open and working on the bookkeeping side of things and building this CRM system and doing social media and planning events. You'll notice we haven't had that many author events this year because I can't do it all myself. So if I can get our numbers together that I can show them, hey, I am taking on editorial work. I'm starting to do writing workshops this fall, FYI. Some of them will be online. We'll start with announcing the ones here in store, and then we're going to be doing some online as well. Once we are fully capitalized, I can start paying myself for a reasonable number of hours and not stay up till 2 or 3 every night, exhausted, trying to just push a little bit harder and then get up again at 8 a.m. and try and get to the store on time and be peppy and on and do everything myself because it's not physically possible. So that is the state of the store. I am taking on some editorial work. In fact, speaking of Summer of the Mariposas, Fall of the Fireflies is set in that same world. It stars the twins, who are the middle girls of the five sisters, and it's a completely new story. You don't have to have read Summer of the Mariposas to pick up Fall of the Fireflies. It's just a fun adventure. Two twins dealing with twin gods. They become monster hunters. And it's very loosely a reimagining of Antigone, the play. This is a standalone, and 10 years later, we came out, more than 10 years later, because this came out last fall, we came out with the first in a trilogy that stars the other sisters. And I am actually, as a freelancer, currently editing, almost done, Spring of the Cicadas, so this stars Odelia, the eldest sister. Fall of the Fireflies stars Velia and Delia, who are the middle twins. Spring of the Cicadas stars Juanita, who is the second eldest. And in the future, Winter of the Witch Moth is coming out a year later, and that will star Peta, who is the youngest of the five sisters. So I am taking on some editorial work, but again, I don't have room for this work until I am fully capitalized enough to be able to hire people to work in the business so I can work on the business. And that is always a challenge when you're a small business owner, trying to figure out how to fund your business. I mean, in the last 3 years, I've done everything from taking out a home equity loan on my home, which I'm very lucky to be able to do, to this year living off of my 401k, which I have now drained. I have no retirement left because getting laid off, there was a time when I could be on unemployment, but now I'm just living on what would have been my retirement in hopes of getting to a point where I can be paying myself on a regular basis from the bookstore. I would like to not lose my house, so making sure that the business itself pays for itself and can pay me is my top priority this year. And that means hiring people who can be competent at making sure that we hit our goals as a business. And that needs numbers, analytics that they can look at, and we can say, okay, we are here right now. This is where we want to go. We need to make what they call SMART goals. I forget what SMART stands for except for measurable. And that's the most important thing here, is that we can measure our success and our growth. And reasonable is one of them as well. So reasonable goals that we can measure and aim for to make sure that our business is growing and so that our employees are growing with it. I'm not looking to get rich here, but I am hoping to actually be able to pay myself regularly and not just rob Peter to pay Paul. So that has been the state of the bookstore. The realistic thing about running a bookstore, even 3 years in, is that we're not yet profitable. And I am not making a living off this bookstore. I am a single woman. I don't have any other form of income other than maybe taking on some editorial work, which does make me wonder, why am I putting all my energy into this bookstore that can't pay me when I could probably just be freelancing from home and have a much simpler and more robust financial life that might even let me take a day off here and there and even a vacation every now and then and be able to afford my health care and dental work. Thankfully, currently I'm on Cobra, but that's super expensive as well. All of these things to say, that's the reality of being 3, almost 4 years into a business like this. Sometimes you have to ask yourself the hard questions and really dig into the numbers and say, are these numbers working? Right now, they're not working. I am hoping that with a small business loan, having enough cash flow that we have a runway to profitability and having a good plan toward profitability with events that we're planning, with perhaps moving to a larger space, being able to offer more things. Maybe we might bring in people to do art classes. Maybe we might expand our book clubs. Most importantly, one thing that we want to do is to have big events with great authors at least 2 to 3 times a month. And that means bringing in more than the 28 people that we can fit in the store here in this location. So I'm actively looking for other alternatives, but everything that I've looked at so far has either had terrible parking is actually smaller than the space that we're in, or are so much bigger and have such higher rent than what we're paying right now that I have to figure out how we'd have the funding to justify it. So there are a lot of factors that go into figuring out the future of your business. What's realistic? What kind of funding do you have? What kind of funding do you need? How do you get access to that funding? There is a grant that I've talked about here before called the Ignite grant. I was applying for that grant last spring and I didn't get it. And right now, as I consider whether we might move or stay here, I don't think I'm going to be applying for it this month. I think the deadline is early September. I don't think I'm going to be applying for it this month either, unless we suddenly find the perfect space to move into, because we need a project to propose that is going to help us to grow the business. And right now, I don't have a good project in mind that would make that happen. So instead, I'm focusing on either an SBA loan or a similar community lending kind of loan that will help us to have breathing space so that I'm not constantly wondering how I'm going to be able to pay the publishers for the books that I've ordered and then ending up taking out a loan from QuickBooks or Square for like 30% interest rate, which of course we're not profitable if we're having to take these short-term loans that have obscene rates when an SBA loan might be closer to like 10%, I think is the current rate. Some of the rates for the state of Connecticut are as low as 4% because they've created a program specifically to help businesses like us. All I need to do is to have the application ready to apply. So that is what I'm working on. That's what I'm working toward. And if you're in Connecticut and need information about getting funding like this, the Connecticut WBDC has all sorts of great resources, including recorded classes and live classes, where you can get this kind of information. Really, really helpful. And they do have free counseling so that if you're a woman-owned business, they can look at your books, they can look at your application and say, oh, consider phrasing it this way, or hey, you're missing this bit of information. You're really going to need that on your application. That is the state of the bookstore, and that is the state of my mind when it comes to book bans in the United States right now. Read some of the Mariposas, read Follow the Fireflies, read banned books, pick them up and hand them to a child in your life. Make sure that those kids have access to the books that people want to keep from them. How can we have any kind of empathy for each other and a care for the common good if we are telling kids that some people's lives don't matter? So that's it. Thanks for listening to the Curious Cat Bookshop podcast. You can always order from us online. Link is below. I'll have links for these books down below. Bye.